I'm not a virgin, she said. The cowboy answered. I never asked you to be. Before we begin, take a moment to drop your city in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? And when the story's over, give it a rating from 0 to 10. Now, settle in and enjoy the tale. The wind moaned across the dry flats, carrying with it the sting of salt and dust. Beneath a sunset, burning red as embers, a wagon sat crippled on the roadside, one wheel broken clean through, the iron rim rolling away until it vanished into the empty stretch beyond. From far off came the slow, heavy rhythm of hooves, breaking the desert stillness like a rip-through cloth. A lone cowboy emerged from the low hills, brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. Boots dust-caked, spurs giving a soft, measured jingle with each step. He stopped in front of the woman, standing silent by the wreck, rain beginning to mist against the brim of her bonnet. Without a word, he held out his hand, calloused, steady, offering help with no questions and no conditions. Red Bluff was the kind of town that lived between a rusted rail line and a stretch of desert that went on until the horizon disappeared. Freight cars sat abandoned like they'd fallen asleep a winter ago. Wheels, wearing the red dust of the West. The only saloon kept its doors swinging day and night, the hinges groaning whenever a gust pushed through Main Street. Out beyond, a dirt road pocked with hoof prints led back into the dry country, where the wind howled like the restless voices of those who'd long since left. Rhodes Barrett was 31, a hired hand, who ran cattle on other men's land. His boots carried the red earth, his wide-brim hat tipped low to hide the kind of eyes that didn't waver easily, eyes that revealed less than half of what they knew. Folks in Red Bluff said Rhodes only spoke when there was real need for it, and when he did, his words landed like a stone dropping into a deep well. That night, the storm rolled in fast, rain and wind hammering tin and timber. In a small cabin at the edge of the pines, fire snapped in the stove, its heat softening the chill in the cramped room. Rhodes sat across from the woman he'd met only that afternoon. Each with a tin plate in hand, neither said much. But there was no awkwardness, just two strangers sharing supper, their silence holding something steadier than words, and an unspoken understanding in the way they looked at one another. Part 1. The Fateful Ride. The sky hung heavy and gray, like iron cooled from the forge. A cold wind cut across the dry flats, stinging the skin. The wagon shuddered, then suddenly lurched to one side. The front left wheel snapped free, rolling away with a hollow rattle until it vanished in a patch of brittle grass. The horses screamed, the sharp scent of their sweat mixing with the dust of the open land. Tessa Bellamy pitched forward, one hand catching the seat's edge while her knees hit the hard-packed earth. She sucked in a breath, lungs filling with grit, then stood and brushed the tangle of hair plastered against her cheek. She didn't cry. She never cried. Not in front of strangers. Far off, the sound of hoofbeats carried through the wind, slow, steady, the kind of pace that didn't belong to a man running away from something. From beyond the low hills came a rider, hat brim pulled low, dark leather coat, heavy with trail dust. A weathered Winchester rested across his shoulder, the dull metal catching the faintest glint as rain threatened on the horizon. He reined in as he reached the scene, his eyes sweeping once broken wheel. Passengers huddled in the wagon, the woman standing square before him. His gaze was calm, not prying, but it told her he'd taken in every detail. "Driver's not fixing that without tools," he said, voice low and clipped, like every word had been weighed before leaving his mouth. "I figured that out myself," Tessa answered, dry as the wind. For just a moment, the corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. The wind turned sharper, slapping cold against her cheeks, carrying the scent of rain like a warning. He introduced himself when he tipped his hat, Rhodes Barrett. Then he looked west, toward the sky, darkening like someone had spilled ink across it. "You won't make Red Bluff before nightfall," he said, "and you don't want to be out here after dark." Tessa stayed quiet, fingers brushing the small knife tucked in her boot. Years had taught her never to rely on anyone, especially not a man. But his voice carried no demand, no claim, only truth. Plain and solid as the ground beneath her boots, Rhodes gave the saddle a pat. "My horse can carry two." A beat of silence. The wind keened over the hill. Then Tessa gave a short nod, her eyes never losing their edge. "Fine, but I carry a knife." "Good. Means you're smart." She stepped forward, his hand rough, steady, lifted her up behind him. And in that first moment, she realized something. He didn't glance back, didn't measure her, just waited for her to settle before nudging the horse forward. The trail was narrow, the ground hard, each hoofbeat landing with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. Low hills on either side lay mottled with gray dust, dry grass bending under the push of the wind. Once, a prairie bird burst from cover, its shadow flashing over the earth before it disappeared. Tessa sat straight, one hand gripping her canvas bag, the other braced on the saddle horn. His back was solid as oak, the heat of him seeping through her thin riding cloak. "You got family in Red Bluff?" he asked. "No, not anymore." He didn't press. She was grateful for that. Most folks, given an answer like hers, would slap a label on it or dig for more. Rhodes only gave a small nod, as if that was all he needed. The sky was leaden now, the smell of rain sharp in the air. The wind shifted colder, pulling damp into their clothes. When the first streak of lightning tore across the horizon, Rhodes muttered under his breath and turned the horse toward the stand of thin pines. "My place is closer. We won't make town dry." She hesitated, but the first icy drops had already kissed her cheek. She nodded. The cabin rose on a hillside small, tight-built, a thread of smoke curling into the rain. The siding was weathered, but the roof sloped deep over the porch. Rhodes swung down, tied his horse, and held out a hand. Inside, the air held the clean bite of pine wood and the softer curl of stove smoke. Heat spread from the fire in the hearth, a battered table, a few chairs, a rifle rack along the wall. No luxury, but neat and well kept. Rhodes hung his hat, set his gun aside, and dug meat and beans from the cupboard. They ate across from each other. The only sounds, the drumming rain on the roof, and the occasional crackle from the stove. No one felt the need to fill the quiet. When the meal was nearly done, Rhodes passed her a wool blanket before settling back in his chair, one boot hooked on the rung. Tessa held the blanket in her lap, fingers tracing the worn weave. She thought of all the times before when help had come with stairs that measured or with strings hidden underneath. Tonight felt different. "I'm not looking for saving," she said, eyes on the rain streaking the window. "I'm not offering that," Rhodes answered slowly. And in that moment, Tessa felt something inside some small, parched corner of her catch the first drop of rain. Trust, fragile, but real. Part 2. Truth in the Rain. The wind whistled through the cracks in the door, driving the steady drum of rain against the cabin's roof. On the table, an oil lamp cast its pale gold glow across the old wood, shadow swaying with every draft that slipped through. Rhodes sat quiet, shoulders turned slightly toward the stove. His boots, soaked through, rested by the fire to dry. A heavy coat hung over the back of a chair, drops of rain pattering onto the floor. Tessa stood by the window, wool blanket drawn around her shoulders. In the fogged glass, her reflection stared back, not the face of a woman afraid, but of someone always braced for the moment she'd be left behind. The scent of burning pine wood mingled with the damp breath of the storm, touching at old memories she'd buried deep. Rhodes said nothing, just held out an enamel mug. Steam curled from it, clouding the edge of the glass. "Thanks," she murmured, eyes turning back toward the rain. The rhythm of water on the roof was as steady as a drumbeat. Tessa eased into the chair across from him, both hands wrapped around the mug, gaze caught in the circle of light spilling from the lamp. She had never cared for long silences, but this one felt different. No waiting, no measuring. The thought came like water slipping through a crack in a dam. She set the mug down, fingers trembling slightly, though her voice stayed even. "I'm not a virgin." Rhodes lifted his head, meeting her eyes. No flicker of surprise, no change in the steady set of his jaw. He laid the spoon beside his tin plate, leaned back just enough to make the chair creak. "I never asked you to be," he said, slow and deep, as if each word was placed with care. The wall she'd built over years, stone by stone, from judgment, disdain, and the narrowing gaze of strangers cracked right there. Not because he promised anything, but because he saw no reason to judge. Tessa leaned back, her eyes fixed on the worn planks underfoot. "Men have touched me without seeing me," she said softly. "They left marks you can't see, but they've lasted longer than the bruises." Rhodes didn't interrupt. He only tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady as bedrock. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the window panes. After a long moment, he said, "I see you." Her head lifted. In his eyes there was no pity, only recognition, like he'd taken in everything she carried, and still saw her as someone worth looking at straight on. "You didn't owe me that," he added, "but thank you." They sat in stillness, the fire snapping, the rain falling. Every time the wind pressed against the roof, the flame leaned to one side, shadows shifting across both their faces. Rhodes rose, added another log to the stove, then came back to the table. She noticed the rough calluses of his hand as he set the wood down, damp from rain, but warm with the heat of the fire. He didn't ask more, didn't advise, didn't try to fix her. And in that quiet, she understood something. Sometimes, safety isn't a place without danger. It's where no one tries to make you into someone else. Night sank deep. The rain had softened into a thin, even curtain. Tessa stood, stepped to the window, fingertips brushing the cold pane. "I'm just trying to start over," she said. Without turning, Rhodes came to stand beside her, close enough to share the space, but not touching. "Then start here," he said. "You're safe?" She turned to him, eyes damp, but voice steady. "I don't want saving. I'm not offering that." Tessa drew a long breath. Somewhere in her chest, that dry, barren ground soaked in another rain. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, she believed one thing. She'd found a place to stand. Part 3. Proving herself. Morning broke over Red Bluff, bright and blue, but the light carried no warmth. Sunlight slid across weathered rooftops, down the porch rail of the saloon, and caught on the peeling paint of a sign that read, "Boarding House." Tessa stood at the foot of the steps, skirt hem dusted from the road, her hand tight on the strap of her canvas bag. The door swung open, and Mrs. Given appeared, a stout woman in a deep blue dress, hairpin neat, eyes sharp as a surgeon's blade. She looked Tessa over, from hat brim to boot sole, the way a rancher might size up a strange horse before deciding whether to feed it. "You're late." Stage broke a wheel. Excuses don't clean linens. No further questions. Just a wicker basket pressed into her hands and a nod toward the stairs. Orders didn't need repeating. The laundry room sat at the back, its low ceiling and pine plank walls stained by years of steam. The air was thick with the bite of lye soap, and the metallic tang of well water cold enough to seep through cloth and skin alike. Tessa slipped off her overshirt and set to work, scrubbing each bedsheet with calloused hands. The water was knife cold, but she didn't slow, keeping her rhythm steady. Her back straight, footsteps creaked behind her. Mrs. Given stood in the doorway, gaze dropping to the wash basin, where the water had gone cloudy and the linens had begun to whiten again. Without a word, she turned and left. Tessa knew silence was its own test, and she wasn't quitting. The first days blurred into a chain of endless chores, pulling tight the corners of clean sheets, wiping fogged windows, hauling buckets of coal from the shed to the kitchen stove. When sweat slid down her spine, she remembered Rhodes' words from the night of the storm. Then start here. And she did, starting with the smallest thing in front of her. At noon, with the church bell tolling from the south end of town, Mrs. Given handed her a tray of food and pointed upstairs. Room 3. Tessa carried it up, knocked lightly. A merchant from Texas, leg bound in plaster, answered. His eyes passed over her without that familiar edge she had braced for only the weariness of a man far from home. She set the tray on the table, gave a small nod, and left. And in that moment, she knew she'd held her own ground. One morning, as she tied her apron strings, her fingers brushed something in the pocket, a small piece of metal, a worn key with a brass tag stamped pantry. No note, no explanation, but she understood. This was the storeroom Mrs. Given always kept locked, opened only when necessary. In the kitchen, she found the boarding house keeper slicing bread. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. Tessa gave a small nod. Mrs. Given said nothing, just turned back to her work. Recognition without words, she thought, might be more certain than any compliment. By sundown, the rails west of town glowed red as the sun sank behind them. Tessa stood alone on the boarding house porch, the smell of soap still clinging to her hands, her chest full of slow, even breaths. From here, she could just make out the low hills where Rhodes lived. A thin line of smoke rose against the darkening sky. It wasn't time to go back yet, but when she did, she promised herself it wouldn't be as someone seeking shelter. She'd return as a woman who carried her own worth. Red Bluff was no longer just a stranger's town. It was slowly becoming the place where she could stand on her own 2 feet, no one holding her up. Part 4. The Reunion. Late morning in Red Bluff. The air carried the heat of forged iron from the blacksmith shop. The ring of hammer on anvil blended with the grind of wagon wheels over the dry-packed street. Tessa stepped out of the general store, a wicker basket swinging from her hand. Her hair was tied back neat, her dress still dusted with flour. Through the narrow gap between 2 buildings, she spotted a familiar figure leaning easy against a water trough in front of the cooper shop. Hat brim low, a coil of rope slung over one shoulder. Rhodes. He hadn't seen her yet, but the stillness in his stance, the quiet, sure weight of it struck something deep in her chest, a place that still remembered the sound of hoofbeats on a rain-soaked evening. Rhodes lifted his head, catching her gaze. He didn't smile, just touched the brim of his hat. You look well. I'm working. It suits me. Between them lay a space with no name, wide enough for the wind to pass through, carrying the scent of dry grass and hot iron. Neither was in a hurry to fill it. A freight wagon creaked past, the wooden wheels complaining. When it moved on, she crossed the street, her steps unhurried but certain. Came out your way last week, Rhodes said. Didn't see you at the ridge. I don't always go the same time, she replied. He tilted his head, a hint of light in his eyes beneath the brim. You left a ribbon tied to the fence post. You saw that. Figured it was for me. It wasn't. Not at first. The words hung there, somewhere between the distant clop of hooves and the warm smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakery across the street. They both knew sometimes a sign wasn't meant as a message at first, but became one the moment the right eyes found it. Rhodes set the coil of rope down. I came to see if you'd walk with me. I'm not looking for a rescue, Tessa said, her eyes holding his. I'm not offering one. They walked the narrow lane behind the blacksmith's, where the noise faded to nothing. The air smelled of wild grass and dry earth, the heat of iron left behind. A fence line stretched toward the open fields. Tessa stopped, leaning her back against the rail, arms folded across her chest. I used to think starting over meant pretending nothing had ever touched me, she said. Now, I think it means carrying it better. Rhodes nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I don't need you to be new. She met his eyes, her voice low. If you take my hand, I'm not just company. I'm not something to pass the time. He stepped closer, the space between them narrowing to a single breath. You're not. Her hand found his no tremor, no hesitation. He held it like something real, not fragile, but not to be lost either. From somewhere far down the tracks, a freight train's whistle called out, long and low, like a punctuation mark on their meeting. Part 5. His brother's secret. Late afternoon light slanted through the tall grass, gold as autumn fire. Rhodes led his horse at an easy walk along the edge of the road, Tessa keeping pace beside him, the hem of her skirt brushing low cactus. Far off, a stand of cottonwoods whispered in the breeze, carrying a trace of water from the nearly dry creek. He said nothing, but the way his eyes sometimes dropped to the dust on his boots told Tessa there was something he meant to say, and it wasn't easy. They stopped at a rocky overlook above the open range. Rhodes pulled off his gloves, reached into his coat pocket, and brought out a small tin box, the lid dented, its seams stained with rust. He opened it. Inside were only a few things: 3 silver coins, a broken shirt button, and a folded scrap of paper. Without a word, he handed her the paper, his gaze fixed on the far line of the horizon where the sun was lowering. Tessa unfolded it carefully. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. Byland. Build a house with windows that open. Don't die alone. She read each line slowly, as though she might lose something between the words. When she looked up, Rhodes was still staring into the distance, his jaw set hard. Your brother? She asked. Yeah? Fever took him fast. Wrote that before he got sick. Never showed it to anyone. The wind pushed through, carrying the faint creak of a sun-cracked fence. Tessa folded the paper, holding it in her palm. He was afraid. Rhodes nodded once, not of dying, just not wanting to go without anyone knowing who he'd been. She drew a breath. In her chest, a memory stirred. Those days she'd left the East, feeling herself vanish from every map anyone she knew might have held. No one came looking. No one asked. I think about that too, she said quietly. Not dying, but being forgotten. He turned, met her eyes without flinching. I won't forget you. Not ever. They sat together on the rock, sharing a small loaf she'd brought along. The sun spilled its gold across the land like honey, and high above, a hawk circled, its shadow sweeping the grass before vanishing. Rhodes closed the tin box, but slipped the folded paper into the inside pocket of his coat against his chest. When he rose, he reached for her hand to help her up. It was as steady as the first time he'd offered it from the saddle, only warmer now, shaped by shared work and trust. No words were spoken, but the promise was clear. Neither of them would be left to vanish in silence. Part 6. The invitation to stay. The sun was already sinking beyond the ridge, its last light spilling long over the dry grass. Behind the barn, a small shed leaned against the slope beside the cabin, the tin roof rust-streaked, but catching a faint glow. Rhodes stood there, untying the rope knotted around a heavy tarp. When the cover fell away, Tessa saw the neat stacks of fresh-cut planks beneath, their edges still fragrant with sap. He glanced at her, didn't rush his words. The evening breeze carried the damp scent of earth from fields that had seen rain 2 nights before. Started cutting them last winter, Rhodes said, running his hand along the smooth edge. Didn't know what for yet. She stepped closer, fingertips grazing the clean grain. You building something? Was thinking. Adding to the cabin. Room enough for 2. Maybe more. She looked up. His eyes were steady. No trace of jest. This wasn't an idle offer. It was an intention he'd kept warm for months. Tessa took a step back, letting her gaze sweep the open ground beside the cabin, where he'd likely pictured that new room. In her mind's eye, she saw a morning, the window thrown open to mist on the fields, the sound of a rooster from the coop. The image pulled tight in her chest. I don't want to walk back to town after every Sunday. Rhodes went on. I want you to stay. If you want that too. Rain from the night before still clung to the roof, each drop falling into the wooden gutter with a slow rhythm, like her heartbeat. She closed the distance between them, hand brushing the worn collar of his coat. I want a life with hands in the soil, she said carefully. I want to wake and know the day's mine to shape. I want to belong somewhere. Again, Rhodes nodded. Voice? Sure, you belong here. The words were simple, but heavier than any vow. They didn't promise heaven, only a real patch of earth to stand on. They folded the tarp again, lashed the planks tight against the night damp. When the work was done, Rhodes held out his hand. She placed hers in it, a hand used to callus and dust, yet warm enough to root her in place. There was no ring, no flowers, but both understood the room would be built, and a new life would begin here. Part 7. A simple wedding. The sun had just cleared the ridge, washing a sleepy Red Bluff in pale gold. The general store on Main Street opened early, the scent of flour and roasted coffee drifting through its wooden door. Rhodes wore a white shirt, pressed smooth, a black coat over it, one he saved for rare occasions. His boots had been wiped clean of trail dust. Beside him, Tessa walked in a dress the color of ripe wheat, every seam hand-stitched during quiet afternoons. No veil, no bouquet, just her hair pinned neat and her eyes brighter than most days. Inside, the smell of pine boards mingled with dried herbs hanging from the rafters. A single oil lamp burned behind the counter, throwing a soft, warm light. Mrs. My Given stood there in her familiar deep blue dress, hair pinned tight, eyes missing nothing. You ready? She asked. No blessing, no polite flourish. Rhodes nodded. Tessa did the same, her hand giving the faintest tug at her skirt hem. Though her face stayed steady, the witness read the words, plain names, a promise to care for each other, and the final question. Do you? I do, Rhodes said, voice low and sure, like a stone laid firm in the earth. I do, Tessa answered, calm and certain, no tears. But in the look they gave each other, there was something stronger than a sudden rush of feeling. It was the choice, weighed and measured over days, nights, and seasons. Mrs. Given signed the paper, slid it across. Rhodes tucked it into his coat pocket, then turned to Tessa. Let's go home. That word home made her step falter, just a beat. Until now, home had always been a stopover. Now it had walls, a roof, and someone waiting. They stepped into the sunlit street, where the wagon ruts lay deep in the dirt, gilded by the high morning light. Rhodes' black horse stood ready under the porch. He helped her into the saddle, swung up in front, and took the reins. They rode out of town to the steady beat of hooves, past the open grass where the wind carried the scent of wild hay and dust. When the cabin came into view at the foot of the hill, thin smoke rose from the chimney. Tessa leaned just enough to see his face. Rhodes didn't turn, but shifted one hand back to touch hers where it rested at his belt. A quiet reminder that, from now on, this road belonged to them both. Part 8. The First Winter. A north wind swept down from the mountains, carrying the first snow of the season. The flakes danced like white ash, catching on the cabin roof and settling along the fence rails. Rhodes drew his coat tight, hammering a board over the drafty gap in the barn wall. Tessa stood close, a basket of nails in her hands, blowing into her fingers now and then for warmth. They worked without much talk. The steady strike of the hammer joined the whistle of wind across the range. Each time Rhodes reached for a nail, their eyes met briefly, just long enough to know neither of them was facing this weather alone. By late afternoon, snow lay thick across the porch steps. Inside, Tessa lit the stove and set a black iron pot on the grate. The smell of beef, simmering with potatoes and carrots, filled the room, pressing back the cold, seeping through the walls. Rhodes hung his coat near the door, his breath still white from the air outside. He washed his hands, then broke bread and set it beside the fire. They ate slowly across from each other, the warmth creeping back into their bones. Now and then, Tessa topped off his cup with fresh coffee, and he'd give a small nod in place of thanks. The quiet felt full, like the cold beyond the walls didn't exist, only the two of them, and the supper they'd made together. One night, a hard wind tore a plank loose from the roof. By morning, the sky was leaden. Rhodes hauled out the ladder with a coil of tar paper over his shoulder. "It's cold up there," he told her. "Then I'll work faster," she said, the glint in her eyes enough to close the matter. On the roof, they worked side by side, fingers stiff but sure, trading tools without a word. When it was done, Rhodes brushed a wet strand of hair from her cheek and didn't speak no need. That evening, the snow fell thicker, muting every sound. They sat at the window, watching the white cover the yard, erasing yesterday's tracks. Tessa wrapped a wool blanket around her shoulders and leaned into the chair back. Rhodes sat beside her, knife in hand, whittling a new spoon. The scent of fresh-cut wood mixed with the muffled rush of wind outside. No talk, but nothing missing. They both knew come morning they'd shovel paths, cook breakfast, mend what needed mending. And with each day, like that, the winter would pass without taking anything from them but time. In late February, a calf dropped in the middle of a blizzard. Rhodes came in from the barn, snow crusted on his coat. "There's a new calf out there," he said. Tessa smiled in the dark. "Then spring's coming." They lay still, listening to the wind rage on. But inside, the fire's warmth and the fact of each other made the cold seem far away. That first winter hadn't just kept them alive. It bound them together, as if every storm had wrapped one more loop of rope tight around the two of them. Part 9. A Home That Grows. Early summer sun lay gold across the young corn, the leaves whispering in a light breeze. Tessa knelt between the bean rows, hands quick at pulling weeds. The hem of her dress touched with dirt. Two children ran circles through the yard, a dark-haired boy with his father's steady eyes, and a brown-haired girl whose bright voice filled the morning with questions. Rhodes leaned his rake against the fence, watching from a distance. The smile was small, but it couldn't be hidden. He didn't call to them, just let them run. The patter of small feet in the soft earth, mixing with the rustle of leaves. One morning, he led the old mare from the barn, reins in hand, and looked to his son. "Hold here, not too tight." The boy fumbled at first, but his grip steadied as the mare lowered her head, blowing out a long breath. Tessa stood close, the little girl pressed to her side, eyes wide. Rhodes let the boy feel the weight and warmth of the animal, waiting until the reins were held just right before giving a single nod, a small moment, but one that marked a step forward. By autumn, golden cottonwood leaves carpeted the yard. They set a long table out on the porch, spread with cornbread, roast meat, and steaming bowls of pumpkin soup. The boy told how he'd helped his father mend the fence. The girl showed the hawk she'd drawn and hung in the kitchen. Rhodes and Tessa didn't interrupt. They simply listened. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth into every word, sealing the memory in a way that would make them smile years later. On a winter morning, their breath rose white as the whole family made its way to the barn. Rhodes checked the doors. Tessa laid out hay. The children took turns pouring warm water into the trough. No one complained about the cold work was shared, and everyone knew their part. When it was done, Rhodes slung an arm around his son's shoulders. Tessa pulled her daughter's wool cap lower. They headed back to the cabin, laughter slipping in before the wooden door shut the north wind out. By late afternoon, Rhodes sat on the porch steps, his son beside him sharpening a pocket knife. Tessa and the little girl watered the flowers in clay pots. No talk of the future, no need. The home, the land, and the hands tending it were answer enough. Rhodes glanced toward Tessa, catching her watching the children. Between them passed an unspoken truth. They had built something once thought impossible. Part 10. The Fire by the Stove. Winter night. Wind tore past the cabin walls. Snow thudding against the windows in slow, steady beats. Inside, the stove glowed red, flames curling around pine logs with a soft crackle like a slow, sure heartbeat. Rhodes sat in the wooden rocker, boots planted, arms stretched toward the heat. Tessa came from the kitchen, carrying 2 enamel mugs of coffee, cinnamon drifting on the steam. She set one in front of him, then took the chair opposite, without asking if he wanted it. The firelight brought out the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the pale scar at his temple, a mark from years in the wind and dust. Tessa didn't ask about it. She knew enough to understand every scar had a story, and he'd tell it if he chose. Rhodes caught her gaze, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. No words. Both knew here no one was looked at through the eyes of judgment. Outside, the wind hit harder, rattling the panes. Rhodes reached across the table, palm up, silent invitation. Tessa laid her hand in his smaller, but not fragile, a hand calloused from turning soil, carrying water, mending clothes. They stayed that way, not gripping, not letting go. The quiet between them wasn't empty. It was full, heavy with the sense that everything had settled where it was meant to be. Beyond the walls, snow buried the path to the cabin. Inside, the fire lit the small things that made a home. The spoon Rhodes had carved for her, the wool scarf she'd knitted for him, the hand-drawn map their son had made with crooked lines and bold letters. They spoke of neither tomorrow nor the past. They'd outlasted both together. The flames dropped lower, painting their faces gold. Tessa leaned back, eyes half closed. Rhodes saw the faint smile at her lips. A smile that said what she'd lost had returned, not in its old shape, but in something better. No music, no guests, just 2 people, certain they'd stopped in the right place. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and late snow, but inside, the heat wrapped around every breath. Rhodes leaned back, eyes steady on her. She traced the chair's worn armrest with her fingertips, touching the marks time had carved into the wood. They didn't need to speak. Every callus, every weather line, every plank replaced, and harvest survived was proof they'd built this with their own hands. Tessa smiled, not from a rush of joy, but from something deeper, peace, rooted. Rhodes brushed the back of her hand. a quiet promise that the past no longer weighed them down, and the present was where they stood firm. Outside, darkness swallowed the horizon. Inside, they looked at each other, knowing what had always been true. Where the fire burned, there was home.